We have been studying a book called 30 Life Principles, and this book is just giving us principles to live by. It's not to take the place of God's word, of course, but kind of a help in knowing God in a deeper way. And you know, ladies, we all study the word. We all come to church. We all listen to sermons. We all pray. We all have devotionals. Why do we do all that? Why do we do all that?
To get closer to God.
Get closer to God. And actually, we are preparing ourselves for what? Our destination, our final destination, eternity. Because all of us in this room have been given an invitation, and every one of us said yes to the invitation. And now we are just preparing for that final destination. And before we look at our principle tonight, and I'll just warn you ladies, it's kind of a downer principle. It's not, don't worry, be happy. It's dark moments last as long as necessary for God to fulfill his purpose. None of us like dark moments, but we all have them, and we all will continue to have them. But before we look at that principle and kind of dig into it, I want to look at a parable of preparation. So let's turn to Matthew 25. This is the parable, and you all know it, of the 10 bridesmaids. 10 virgins waiting for the bridegroom. Now, ladies, you know this. Weddings have changed a lot, haven't they? Not just in this time of COVID, before COVID. 52 years ago, when I got married, weddings were basically all about the same. You had a man show up in a tux or a nice suit, and a woman in her wedding gown, and everybody gathered at the church. You had kind of a short and simple, sweet ceremony, and then where do we all go? Reception. The fellowship hall. Yeah. The reception, and there, name 3 things you would have at those simple weddings.
Cake and punch.
Cake and punch. What else?
Nuts.
Peanuts. If you were well off, they were mixed. Nuts.
And those men.
And mints, of course. So, it was simple. But let me tell you, ladies, nothing is simple, it seems, about weddings today. They're a major production, and they're a major expense. I went to one not too long ago, because you know nowadays, what do you have to have a wedding?
A destination.
You have to have a venue. And so recently, Bill and I went to a wedding at a venue. And just out of curiosity, after it was over, I kind of did some digging to see, you know, how much it costs to have a wedding at this venue. $5,000 for just a simple, not showy wedding. But you got to choose your environment. You could choose a church, or you could choose a garden, or you could have a Tuscan villa to have your wedding. Did that door open by itself? Okay. So you had those 3 choices, and if none of those made your daughter happy, then you can always have a destination wedding. And according to bridal.com, the average cost today of a destination wedding is $38,000. And that is just, you know, the run-of-the-mill, pretty simple destination wedding. Weddings have evolved, that's for sure. But the wedding we're going to read about is one of those simple ones. Let's look at verse 1 and 2 and see who was invited to this wedding. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. So some versions, does any of your versions say prudent for wise? Okay. Someone who is sound in thinking, who really makes an effort to make good decisions is prudent. But here we have 5 foolish virgins and 5 wise virgins who were invited to this wedding. Now, the wedding ceremony represents what we talked about in just a few minutes ago, that ultimate time when Jesus will come back, when he, the bridegroom, will be joined together with his church, the bride of Christ. But I think we can safely assume that sitting in our congregation, there are both foolish and wise. We can't tell by looking. I mean, I can pick out some, but y'all don't want me to. We read in Matthew 13 about, and you probably remember this parable about the wheat and the tares or weeds. How a man sowed his field with good seed, and while he was sleeping, the enemy came in and sowed weeds among the wheat. And when the seed sprouted and the crop came up, the servants came to the owner and said, "How could this happen? We know you planted good seed." And the owner said, and this is in Matthew 13, the owner said, let me find it here. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" In other words, do you want us to go out into that field and pull the tares up, pull the weeds up? And he answered, "No, because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." So can we assume from this that in our church, in our congregation, we have probably wheat and tares, wise and foolish. So what separates the wise and the foolish? Well, let's go back to our parable now and read verse 3. The foolish ones took their lamps, but they did not take any oil with them. The wise ones, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. The bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. And at midnight, a cry rang out, "Here's the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all the virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish one said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil. Our lamps are going out." "No," they replied, "there may not be enough for both us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." What separated the wise and the foolish virgins was preparation. The foolish said yes to the invitation, got oil for their lamps. They were done. They were happy. They were at peace with what they had done. But the wise, who also said yes to the invitation, prepared for the greatest event of their life. They thought, or probably didn't think, maybe neither one, the wise or the foolish, may not have taken into account the bridegroom may not come immediately. He may delay. But possibly the wise thought, if he does delay, maybe I should take some more oil to be safe. Now, that doesn't mean, I think it's interesting to note in this parable that they both slept. Both the wise and the foolish got drowsy and went to sleep. But the sleep of the wise was peaceful because of their preparation. So let's finish in verse 10. But while they were on their way to buy oil, the foolish virgins, the bridegroom arrived, and the virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, the others also came. Lord, Lord, they said, open the door for us. But he replied, truly I tell you, I don't know you. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour. There's so many lessons in this parable, ladies, but one of the lessons is you cannot borrow your way into the kingdom. That's what was happening in verse 8 and 9. You know, when Bill and I, we knew when our children left for college that it wouldn't take long for them or us to figure out if their faith was their own or if it was borrowed from us or the youth group or their friends. It didn't take long, but a borrowed faith from anybody cannot withstand what we come up against in life. It has to be your own faith. Because sometimes, and you know this, it seems like trials just keep coming. Now, they're not all major trials. We all have little trials, big trials, you know, but things in our life that just aren't right, and they keep coming. They can be relational and financial, spiritual, physical, but they can be discouraging and they can be draining. But if we are prepared, like these 5 wise virgins, we will have the tools necessary to withstand the tests that are given to us in the field of life. And what a reward. James says, blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, he will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those that love him. One disadvantage we have when we're going through dark times is that we can only see right in front of us. And I don't know about y'all, but when I'm going through, I really get tunnel vision. I can only see what is going on at that moment. But of course, God sees the big picture. He knows the beginning and the end. We basically see what's in front of us. We have no idea what God is trying to accomplish through that dark moment in our life. And that's why James also says, consider it pure joy, my brethren, when you face trials of many kinds, knowing that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Now, my dad was a farmer and a dairyman, and not those fancy, I don't know if y'all have driven to Clovis and see those state-of-the-art dairies with hundreds and hundreds of cattle. No, that's not what he had. This was a small 3-man operation. My dad, his brother, and my grandfather. About 10 to 12 Holstein cows that produced enough milk to sell and produced enough milk for the family to drink. Hence, my reason for hating milk. If ever you've had milk given to you out of a bucket and saying, now scoop that cream off first before you drink that milk. Oh, mercy. When I thought, when I leave this place, I'm never drinking another ounce.
But the fresh butter you make out of that cream.
Yeah, I'm sure, but when my dad's dad, when my grandfather died, and my dad's brother got very sick, he decided to leave the farm, and he decided to go into the farm machinery business, selling farm machinery. And that was a good decision for quite a few years. That made a very good living for our family, and until the cattle market bottomed out. The wheat prices turned into nothing. Corn prices turned into nothing. And the whole country at that time was kind of going through an economic depression. Now, when farmers don't get good prices for their products, what is the first thing they quit buying? Farm machinery. They get by with what they have. If it's broken, they fix it. So it was a bad time for my dad. And I was in high school at the time. And I remember my dad sitting in the living room after everybody had gone to bed. At least he thought we had all gone to bed. From my bedroom, I could crack the door and see straight into the living room. And I would see him in there sitting alone, smoking a cigarette. Back then, everybody did. Smoking a cigarette with a Bible in his lap, listening to Eddie Arnold singing, "Make the World Go Away." And it always made me sad to see my dad like that. I could tell he was distraught, and I knew deep down my world was getting ready to change. And it did change. He lost the business, and he started struggling to find his new identity. He didn't want to go back to the farm. And so he found this and that to kind of get by, and then my mother went to work for the first time in her life. But a relative one day told him about a job opening up for the state of New Mexico as an auditor. And he applied and got that job, and he worked there for over 25 years. It was a godsend, not only for the income, but for the pension, which we don't see much of anymore, and insurance. And it actually sustained my mother until she died. And he often told me, when I lost that business, I thought our life would never be the same again. But what was never the same again was my spiritual life. And I knew that during that time, he grew closer to God. I'm not sure, though, as a sophomore in high school, if I had gone to my dad and said, you know, Otis, I always called him Otis, I didn't call him Dad. Otis, don't worry. You have a great inheritance waiting for you someday. I'm not sure how that would have been received. It's kind of what happened in 1 Peter 1. Did I give that to somebody? 1 Peter 1, 1 through 9.
Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to God's elect, exiles scattered throughout the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, who have been chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, through the sanctifying work of the Spirit, to be obedient to Jesus Christ and sprinkled with his blood. Grace and peace be yours in abundance. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he's given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. This inheritance is kept in heaven for you, who through faith are shielded by God's power until the coming of the salvation that is ready to be revealed in the last time. In all this, you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though we find by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. Though you have not seen him, you love him. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and are filled with an inexpressible and glorious joy, for you are receiving the end result of your faith, the salvation of your souls.
Let's remember, ladies, when Peter wrote that, he wrote it to exiles, meaning people who were not living where they were born or in their home. And the reason they were exiles is they were scattered because of persecution in and around Jerusalem. We read about that in Acts 8, and I'll just read the first verse. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. And these exiles that Peter is writing to, they're still being persecuted. And Peter knows it's only going to intensify, because at least 15 times in this letter he refers to suffering. And according to what I read, he uses 8 different Greek words to describe the suffering. At that time, Nero was the emperor, and the persecution of Christians is well documented, from throwing them into the arena with wild animals to making lampshades out of their skin for his palace. So when Peter is encouraging them, like Karen read, and telling them they have an inheritance that is incorruptible and doesn't fade away. Considering what they were going through, how do you think they received that message from Peter?
They weren't feeling very blessed.
With wonder and disbelief. I mean, just really, okay. It would just be hard to understand.
Yeah. Do you think it would be hard to accept if they were going through all that, just to think, oh, okay, I'll go into the arena. He also said in verse 6 to 7 that they should rejoice when dark times come and they face opposition. Do you think, I just think it would be hard for them to agree with that. And possibly they were in a different place spiritually than I see myself in a time of persecution. Because when trouble comes, lots of times the first thing we do is start doubting God's mercy. We start doubting that He is there. And we forget to thank Him for the dark times. I can honestly tell you that my dad and my family did not thank God when our house was being sold at auction to pay off the bank. I never remember my dad saying, thank God for this adversity. We just didn't do that. It wasn't until much later in his life when he was, and you all have done this, look back on your life and said, oh yeah, now I get why that happened. Now I get why I'm the way I am now because of that. And that's what my dad did. Because, ladies, adversity will reveal where your faith is. Now, I don't play golf, but I have friends that play golf. And I had an uncle in Roswell, Uncle Tony. He was from Chicago. Chicago is how he said it, because he was a Polak, as we called him, which I'm sure was not or isn't politically correct. But anyway, he was a big golfer. And he told us one time that he wanted to see if he really was a good golfer. Because he had figured out that going out with his golfing buddies, 4 guys, foursome, that they all had great scores, and he could never figure out why until he figured out they didn't follow the rules. So he wanted to see if he was a good golfer. So he went out alone and he followed all the rules. If the ball landed near a tree, he left it there, and that's where he took his shot. If the ball landed in a sand trap, he hit the ball from the sand trap. But his buddies would move the ball out of the sand trap and then hit it, or move the ball away from the tree and then hit it. And so that's why their scores were so good. But that's the way it is with our faith, ladies. Do you want to know if your faith is really solid and strong and secure? Then follow the rules during the dark times. Follow the rules in your life. If you're not careful, if you're not wise during the dark times, you'll make decisions out of the energy of the flesh. You'll jump to quick conclusions and forget to put the brakes on. That's what I do. I just plow ahead without really thinking through everything real carefully. Because wise decisions in dark times are never made in a hurry. Stay close to God, pray, worship, wait. And don't think because you won the battle yesterday that God kind of has your perseverance in a credit account and you can depend on it in the next 2 or 3 days when you have another trial. Every time you have a dark time, you have to reboot your perseverance. And we're going to look at an example in David's life of a dark time and learn from his mistakes. We're going to be in 1 Samuel 27. You know this. David is on the run from Saul. Saul is the present king of Israel, and he is hunting David to kill him out of a lot of reasons: jealousy, fear, mental illness, I don't know what all. But the very first sentence in chapter 27 rings a dark bell. But David thought to himself. You know, ladies, it's very important during dark times that when we talk to ourselves, and we all do, you're doing it now, you're having a conversation in your head. It's important when we have that conversation in our head that we say the right thing to ourselves. But David had looked at his situation and he sized it up solely on a horizontal level, and he pushed the panic button. He was pessimistically looking at his future. And of course, any future without God is bleak. Because you remember, Samuel had anointed David as king. He was already anointed. God spoke to him and spoke to him through other people who said to him, you will be ruler over Israel. And even Saul, his enemy, said in chapter 24, I know that you shall surely be king, and that your hand, the kingdom will be established in your hand. But for some reason, and we can all understand this because we may have been there once or twice in our life, David ignored that, the promises of God, and he convinces himself, I'm going to die and I'll never be king. And this is a good example of what I said a few minutes ago, that if we're not wise during dark times, we will our thoughts will be through the energy of the flesh, the carnal mind. David thought, times are hard. God has deserted me. I thought I'd be king, but I'll never be king. I'm going to die if I keep on being at the front edge of Saul's army. They'll catch up with me. So he comes to this conclusion. You know how I talked about if you don't put the brakes on, which David should have done, but he didn't. And he comes to this conclusion. It's actually in the last part of that first verse. David thought to himself, one of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Oh, mercy, ladies. You know, we don't hear much about the carnal Christian. We hear a lot about the lost person who's never met Jesus. We hear a lot about the saved person who's walking in victory. But not much is said about that believer who chooses to disobey God and operate in the flesh. And David, at this point, is a clear example of someone who is a believer on the inside, but on the outside, he looks like a non-believer because of the way he's living his life. Do you see anywhere in just that first scripture where he asked God, should I go to the land of the Philistines? I read a quote which is so true. Man is the only animal that runs faster when he has lost his way. I don't know if you've ever seen a child lost. They run this way and run that way and run, mama, 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 and they're just running every which way. And that's how we do sometimes, whenever we are going the wrong way. So David and the 600 men with him left and went over to Achish, son of Maoch, king of Gath. And David and his men settled in Gath with Achish. Each man had his family, and David had his 2 wives. Now, when Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched for him. Then David said to Achish, if I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be assigned to me in one of the country towns, that I may live there. Why should your servant live in the royal city with you? the decision that David made not only affected him, but affected a lot of other people. And ladies, any decision you make doesn't just affect you. I don't care if you're alone or have a large family. Any decision you make affects others. And so, unbelievably, David went to Gath. I don't know if that rings a bell. Where was Goliath from? Gath. He was called Goliath of Gath. And David runs there to his hometown and decides to live there with Achish, the king, the arch enemy of Israel. And in fact, in verse 5, I don't know if you noticed, he even calls himself a servant of Achish. He stays there for 16 months. David, who was called the sweet psalmist of Israel, ends up not writing one psalm during those 16 months, as far as we know. And he seems to just, in his dark time, walk away from God. He spends his days raiding nearby towns and murdering and plundering and answering to King Achish. And there just doesn't seem to be a lot of joy in David's carnal phase in Gath. So on that day, Achish gave him Ziklag, and it has belonged to the kings of Judah ever since. David lived in Philistine territory 1 year and 4 months. And David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. From ancient times, these people had lived in the land extending to Shur and Egypt. And whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive, but took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels and clothes. Then he returned to Achish, and Achish would ask, "Where did you go raiding today?" And David would say, "Against the Negev of Judah, or against the Negev of Jerahmeel, or against the Negev of the Kenites." He did not leave a man or woman alive to be brought to Gath, for he thought they might inform on us and say, "This is what David did." And such was his practice as long as he lived in Philistine territory. Achish trusted David and said to himself, "He has become so obnoxious to his people, the Israelites, that he will be my servant for life." It's kind of hard to read that about David, a man after God's own heart. He is sowing the wind, but he is getting ready to reap the whirlwind. King Achish begins to get some flack from the people. They don't trust David. They don't want him fighting their battles. They don't want him living in Ziklag. Some of them had long memories. They remember that David, that little upshot, is the one who killed their mighty warrior, Goliath. Now we go to chapter 29, in verse 6, we see King Achish and David in a confrontation. So Achish called David and said to him, "As surely as the Lord lives, you have been reliable, and I would be pleased to have you serve with me in the army. From the day you came to me until today, I have found no fault in you, but the rulers don't approve of you. Now turn back and go in peace. Do nothing to displease the Philistine rulers." "But what have I done?" asked David. "What have you found against your servant from the day I came to you until now? Why can't I go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" And Achish answered, "I know that you have been pleasing in my eyes as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the Philistine commanders have said, 'He must not go with us into battle.' Now get up early, along with your master's servants who have come with you, and leave in the morning as soon as it is light. So David and his men got up early and in the morning to go back to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. Now, in chapter 30, we see David descend into depression. David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. Now, the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had taken captive the women and everyone else in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. When David and his men reached Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. You can just see in your mind David and his men coming over that hill on horseback, and there before them is the city where they had lived for a year and a half, and the entire place is burned to the ground. But worse than the physical destruction was the personal loss, because all their wives and children had been taken away as captives by the Amalekites. Now, the Amalekites were the same people that David had raided. David knew what happened to captives. He knew what he did to captives. Maybe not killed them, but he knew what they did, especially to women captives. Because the old saying, you don't look behind the door unless you've hid there yourself, came true. And he was looking behind the door. And he and his men wept until they had no more tears. I don't know if you've ever cried that long before. I have, where you have no tears. You have no strength. You have nothing left. But look what happens in verse 6. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. Now, these are the same men that David had been a guide to, a friend to, a leader. And he had trained them in the cave. They were his crack troops from the wilderness of Paran, and now they are talking about stoning him because mutiny has boarded the bus. This is the point, ladies, when some people consider taking their own life. He has reached the bottom rung of the ladder, a place where you either jump off into oblivion or cry out to God for forgiveness and rescue. And finally, David made a good choice. The last sentence of verse 6 is a turning point with David. David found strength in the Lord, his God. That last sentence, we have to remember, we started out in chapter 27. Chapter 27, chapter 28, chapter 29, and most of chapter 30, we have not seen or heard David call out to God. For seemingly the first time in 16 months, he looks up and says, please help me, God. And dark days, ladies, as we've talked about, calls for vertical focus. Because dark days aren't designed to lay you on your back and suck you under. They are designed to bring you to your knees and to look up to God. And we know the story ends well in verse 18 through 20. Tells us that David recovered everything that the Amalekites had taken. So what are some life lessons from studying principle number 7? First of all, adversity, I don't know, we don't like it, it doesn't matter. God is sovereign, we're going to have adversity. It's his tool for building godly spiritual character in all of us. Because until you experience heartache, disappointment, pain. You're not equipped, you're not properly equipped for service. Who did I give 2 Corinthians to?
And it's that you pay this. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves have received from God. For just as the sufferings of Christ flow over into our lives, so also through Christ our comfort overflows. If we are distressed, it is for your comfort and salvation. If we are comforted, it is for your comfort, which produces in you patient endurance of the same sufferings we suffer. And our hope for you is firm, because we know that just as you share in our sufferings, so also you share in our comfort.
So ladies, what does that tell us? We can't hoard comfort. When God comforts us in our pain, you can't hoard that, hang on to it. The purpose of that is to teach you how to minister to others when they are going through pain, to share the comfort that God gave to you. Now, tell me what can happen sometime when people who are going through adversity do not turn to God. What can happen?
Suicidal,
Mhm.
bitterness,
Pardon?
bitterness.
Bitterness. I don't know if you've seen people completely turn away from God during dark times because they just cannot accept. You know, I think there was a book, or there was a book written when bad things happen to good people, and one of the things he talks about is a good God will not do some of the things or allow some of the things that happen. You can't have both a good God and a God who does bad things. Well, that's not scriptural. It sounds good, and it's a rationalization for when you do have dark times and you say, forget the God stuff, I'm out of here. Sometimes that can happen. Second, adversity usually comes in the areas where you feel most confident. What do you think about that? Are there areas in your life that you feel very confident about? Be careful. God wants us to be completely, have Him be the person in our life, the God in our life, that we cannot do anything without. He doesn't want us to think we're sufficient, just ourselves. We don't need Him. Who did I give John 15:5 to? Debbie?
I am the vine, you are the branches. If a man remains in me and I in him, he will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing.
Apart from me, you can do nothing. I think some versions say, apart from me, nothing is possible, or something like that. But sometimes we all need to be reminded that we are dependent on God for all things. And third, God's ultimate purpose is to conform you into the likeness of Jesus Christ. And He uses difficulties to get your attention sometimes, to reveal weaknesses in your spiritual armor, to remove pride and self-centeredness, and to demonstrate His faithfulness. So how would you live out this principle of dark times last as long as necessary for God to fulfill His purpose? Well, carve out some chunks of time to pray, and we'll talk about that more next week. Then pray for others who are facing dark times and ask God to intervene where He sees fit and to help them to find joy in their trials. Still not there yet, but I'm working on it. Ask Him to use you as an instrument of comfort and peace for others.